The morning that changed everything. The first light of dawn crept through the blinds of Harriet's diner, casting golden stripes across the worn checkered floor that had seen decades of spilled coffee, laughter, and tears. The smell of fresh biscuits and sizzling bacon floated through the air, mixing with the low hum of conversation. It was a quiet morning, the kind that felt wrapped in comfort and routine. At her favorite corner booth by the window sat Evelyn Price, 72 years old, wrapped in her soft burgundy cardigan that matched the lipstick she'd worn every morning since her husband's death 15 years ago. She was a woman carved by time but unbroken by it, the kind whose presence carried a gentle authority. For 30 years she'd begun every Tuesday here with a cup of black coffee and 2 scrambled eggs. The waitress never had to ask. Evelyn was beloved by everyone who came through those doors. Jenny, the young red-haired waitress barely out of college, adored her like a grandmother. The construction crew that worked on the new shopping plaza always greeted her first before starting their day. Even Harriet herself, owner and keeper of the diner's soul, said the place felt colder whenever Evelyn skipped a morning. But today something felt slightly off. Maybe it was the weather, a gray sky threatening rain, or maybe it was the uneasy silence that hung for a moment when the clock struck 9. Evelyn felt it too, like a tremor in the air that didn't belong. She lifted her coffee and gazed out the window at the slow rhythm of Main Street. People were beginning their day. The florist opening shop, the mailman sorting letters, 2 teenagers laughing over an ice cream truck even though it was still chilly. Evelyn smiled softly, unaware that within the hour, this ordinary morning would turn into the spark that changed not only her life, but the conscience of the entire town. The bell above the door jingled, breaking her thoughts. In stepped Carl Brennan, broad-shouldered, red-faced, and already frowning before he'd taken 2 steps inside. He was known in the town, not for kindness or achievement, but for temper. People called him the man who never smiled. He was the type who made small places feel smaller, his anger filling every inch of space it could find. He worked at the local auto yard, lived on beer and bitterness, and blamed everyone else for what had gone wrong in his life. When he entered Harriet's, conversations died mid-sentence. Jenny, behind the counter, froze halfway through pouring coffee. She whispered, "Good morning, Mr. Brennan," but her voice quivered slightly. Carl didn't answer. He slammed his fist on the counter and barked for fresh coffee, not that watery stuff. His voice was a whip, cutting through the warmth of the diner. Evelyn looked up but said nothing. She'd seen men like him before, loud when they felt powerless, cruel when they felt small. Carl's eyes roamed the diner, searching for something, or someone, to release his inner storm upon. His gaze landed on Evelyn. She sat alone, serene, completely unbothered by the tension. Her calmness seemed to mock him. In his twisted reasoning, her peace became a challenge. He walked toward her table, his boots thudding against the floor like warning drums. "That booth's for paying customers," he said gruffly, looming over her. His tone carried arrogance, not curiosity. Evelyn looked up slowly, her eyes calm but firm. "I am a paying customer," she said with grace. "Have been for 30 years. You can ask Harriet if you doubt it." Her gentle confidence only fueled his rage. Carl sneered, his face twisting. 30 years? Maybe you've gotten too comfortable taking up space meant for people who actually matter." His voice rose enough that the entire diner went silent. Harriet stepped forward from the kitchen, flour still on her hands. "Carl, that's enough. You don't talk to my customers like that." But Carl wasn't listening. He leaned closer to Evelyn. "Move," he barked. Evelyn didn't flinch. Her hands stayed folded neatly on the table, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, the kind of softness that carried power precisely because it refused to shout. "No, I'm quite comfortable where I am." Her calm defiance cracked something inside him. In that moment, years of resentment, insecurity, and ignorance turned into one impulsive act of cruelty. His hand shot out and struck her across the cheek. The sound was loud enough to freeze time. The coffee cup tipped, spilling its contents in a dark river across the table. Evelyn's head turned with the impact, but she didn't cry out. She didn't scream. She simply inhaled slowly and lifted her hand to her cheek, her dignity unshaken even in pain. Jenny dropped the coffee pot, shattering it on the floor. The construction workers leapt from their seats, but no one reached Carl yet. They were stunned by the audacity of what they had just witnessed. Harriet gasped, clutching her apron, her voice trembling. "Carl, what have you done?" Carl stood there, breathing heavily, the shock of his own action settling in. He tried to twist it into justification. "She disrespected me," he said, almost shouting. "She needed to learn some manners." Evelyn slowly turned her head back toward him. There was blood at the corner of her mouth, but her eyes were still calm. When she spoke, her tone was quiet but chilling. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life." Carl gave a cruel laugh, though his voice wavered. "Oh yeah, what are you gonna do, call your knitting club?" The bell over the door jingled again. Soft, almost polite, yet somehow it cut through the tension like a blade. Everyone turned. A tall man in a gray suit stood in the doorway, his presence commanding silence without saying a word. His build was strong but disciplined, his eyes sharp, scanning the room in one sweeping glance. He looked first at the broken coffee pot, then at the trembling waitress, then at the elderly woman with a red mark across her cheek, and something dark flickered behind his composed expression. Evelyn's lips curved faintly, just enough to form a single word. "Malcolm." The man's jaw tightened, but his voice was calm. "Hello, Mom," he said evenly. "I thought I'd surprise you for breakfast." He took a few measured steps forward, every click of his shoes echoing like a countdown. Carl's face drained of color. He didn't yet know who this man was, but instinct warned him. Something about his posture, his tone, the way everyone else unconsciously stepped aside. "Who are you supposed to be?" Carl tried to sound dismissive, but his voice cracked halfway through. Malcolm Price stopped just a few feet away from him. "Special Agent Malcolm Price," he said, drawing back his jacket to reveal the FBI badge clipped to his belt. "And that woman you just struck? She's my mother." The entire diner seemed to exhale at once. Carl stumbled back half a step, his confidence evaporating. Jenny's hands flew to her mouth. Harriet whispered a prayer under her breath. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every word came out precise and deliberate, carrying the weight of authority and something far more personal. "You're going to sit down," he said, "and you're going to stay very, very quiet while we sort this out." Carl blinked rapidly, trying to find his swagger again. "You can't talk to me like that." "I didn't mean—" "Sit," Malcolm interrupted, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Carl sat. Harriet hurried to Evelyn's side, her voice trembling. "Evelyn, are you all right?" Evelyn reached for her napkin, dabbed the blood gently, and nodded. "I'm fine, dear. Just a little bruise. I've had worse." But there was something proud, almost fierce, in her eyes as she looked at her son. Malcolm turned his gaze back to Carl. "You have no idea how much trouble you've just bought yourself," he said quietly. "You think this is about a slap, but it's bigger than that. It's about the way men like you treat women like her, with contempt, as if kindness or decency is beneath you. And that ends today." Carl tried to speak, but words failed him. The diner was utterly still. No one moved, no one breathed too loudly. It was as if justice itself had walked through the door wearing a tailored suit. Malcolm knelt beside his mother, gently inspecting her cheek, his professional composure trembling under the weight of emotion. "You should have called me sooner," he murmured. Evelyn smiled faintly. "You know I don't like making a fuss." "You call it a fuss," Malcolm said softly. "I call it assault." Evelyn's voice carried warmth even now. "Don't make this uglier than it already is, son. Let the truth handle him." Malcolm nodded, stood, and turned back to Carl. "You're lucky," he said. "Because if this weren't my mother, I'd still make sure you paid for it. But since it is, I'll make sure the entire system knows your name before sunset." Carl looked around desperately for help. But every face in the diner, every worker, every student, every witness was watching him with disgust. Even the officers who would later arrive would find a crowd ready to tell the same story, backed by a video recording from a trembling but courageous college girl who refused to stop filming. And as the tension lingered, as the morning sun broke through the clouds and lit the diner's window in warm light, Evelyn Price sat quietly, her cheek still stinging but her spirit unbroken. She reached for her coffee again, her hand steady. "Now," she said calmly, glancing at her son, "let's order breakfast. You must be hungry." Malcolm smiled for the first time that morning, though it didn't reach his eyes. "After we're done here, Mom," he said softly, "I promise you this town will never forget what happened today." The investigation begins. The diner that had always been the heartbeat of the small town, stood frozen in uneasy quiet, as though the walls themselves were trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The faint hum of the old refrigerator was the only sound that dared to exist. Outside, the morning traffic moved on, oblivious to the fact that a storm of justice was brewing behind those glass windows. Evelyn Price sat in her booth with the quiet composure of a queen whose throne had been shaken but not toppled. The mark on her cheek had darkened slightly, a bruise beginning to bloom, but her eyes were calm, her back straight, her dignity untouched. Her son, Special Agent Malcolm Price, stood beside her, still and composed, yet every nerve in his body was alive with restrained fury. Harriet, the diner's owner, tried to gather the broken pieces of the coffee pot from the floor, her trembling hands betraying the strength she'd always carried. "Don't you worry, Evelyn," she murmured, her voice cracking. "That man won't set foot in my diner again, I swear on my life." Evelyn reached across the table and took Harriet's flour-dusted hand gently. "It's all right, dear," she said softly. "Sometimes the world forgets its manners, but it always remembers in the end. What matters is how we respond, not how we're treated." Malcolm looked down at his mother, his jaw tightening. Her serenity was both admirable and infuriating to him. He admired her strength but could not understand her forgiveness. "You shouldn't have to respond to this at all," he said quietly, his voice edged with steel. "You raised me to believe respect is earned, not demanded through fear. He disrespected you, and that means he disrespected everything right in this world." Evelyn smiled faintly. "And that's why you'll make it right without anger. You'll do it the way your father would have wanted, with truth." Across the room, Carl Brennan sat slumped in the booth like a man who had just realized that the world he controlled through intimidation had suddenly grown far too big for him. The swagger that had carried him into the diner had drained out completely. His eyes darted around, seeking a friendly face, a supporter, a lifeline, but every face met him with silent condemnation. The construction workers had crossed their arms, their expressions hard as stone. The college students whispered quietly, phones still recording, capturing every twitch of his nervous movements. Carl's throat went dry as Malcolm turned his gaze toward him again. "You should get comfortable," Malcolm said evenly. "You're not leaving until this is handled properly." A few minutes later, the sound of sirens grew faint in the distance, approaching slowly but steadily. Harriet's diner had never seen police lights outside its door in all her years of ownership. And now they flashed blue and red across the windows like signals from another world. 2 officers entered, one older, heavy-set with a mustache that tried to hide a permanent smirk, and another younger, slimmer, his uniform neat, and his eyes unsure. The older one, Officer Reed, stepped forward first, looking more annoyed than concerned. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his gaze sweeping the room. "We got a call about a disturbance." Malcolm didn't move. He reached into his jacket with slow precision and withdrew his badge, holding it in front of Reed's face. "Special Agent Malcolm Price, FBI," he said firmly. "This man assaulted my mother." Reed blinked, clearly thrown off by the badge but unwilling to relinquish his sense of small-town authority. "Now hold on, Agent Price," he said with forced calm. "Let's not jump to conclusions. I'm sure this was just a misunderstanding." Harriet stepped forward, her apron still smeared with flour, her voice shaking with anger. "Misunderstanding?" That brute hit Evelyn across the face. "We all saw it, Reed. You're not going to turn this into one of your old boys' club excuses." Reed's expression hardened. "Harriet, I think you should let us handle this," he said, his tone dismissive. But Evelyn spoke before Harriet could. Her voice was soft but carried across the room like wind through leaves. "Handle it then, Officer Reed, properly. That's all anyone is asking." The younger officer, Daniels, looked visibly uncomfortable. His eyes darted from Evelyn's bruised cheek to Carl's shifting form, then to Malcolm's unreadable face. Daniels finally stepped forward. "Sir," he said hesitantly to Reed, "maybe we should take statements from everyone." Reed ignored him. "Carl," he said, addressing the assailant with an overly familiar tone, "what happened here?" Carl rubbed the back of his neck, his voice uncertain but trying to sound calm. "It was just a misunderstanding, Sam," he began. She was being rude, wouldn't move her stuff, and I might have, tapped her. Didn't mean to hurt nobody." Malcolm's eyebrow lifted slightly and his voice, when he spoke, was quiet, controlled, but ice cold. "A tap," he repeated. "That's what you call striking a 72-year-old woman so hard that she bled?" Reed scowled. "Agent Price, tone it down. You're out of your jurisdiction here. Malcolm turned slowly toward him. You're mistaken, Officer Reed. Civil rights violations, hate-motivated assaults, and local law enforcement interference are well within my jurisdiction. He paused, his gaze steady. And I'm beginning to see all three right now. Reed's mouth opened, then closed. The diner was dead silent. Everyone could feel the shift, a change in the air as if invisible scales were finally beginning to balance. Sarah Mitchell, the young student who had been quietly recording from her table, raised her phone slightly higher. I have it all on video, she said, her voice trembling but clear. Everything. He hit her and then he threatened her. You can see it all. Reed turned sharply toward her. Young lady, that's an illegal recording. It's not. Malcolm cut in smoothly. This state follows one-party consent. Public setting. She's perfectly within her rights. And if you attempt to confiscate her phone, that will add obstruction of justice to your list. A flicker of panic crossed Reed's eyes, but he tried to cover it with bluster. You think you can come in here and tell me how to do my job? Malcolm's calm remained unbroken. If you were doing your job, I wouldn't need to. Evelyn placed her hand gently on her son's arm, grounding him. Her touch softened the sharp edges in his voice. Let the truth speak, Malcolm, she whispered. He looked down at her, exhaled, then turned back toward the officers. All right, he said slowly. Here's what we'll do. You'll take statements from every witness here, starting with my mother. You'll document the evidence properly, and you'll process an arrest for this man, Carl Brennan, for assault and battery on an elderly citizen. If you fail to do any of those things, I'll call Washington before you leave this diner. Reed's expression flickered between anger and fear. The small-town officer who had spent years using his badge to protect his friends was suddenly staring at a man whose authority stretched far beyond the county lines. Daniels, meanwhile, had begun writing quickly in his notebook, his conscience taking control where fear had ruled moments ago. Ma'am, he said respectfully to Evelyn, could you tell me what happened? Evelyn smiled faintly. Of course, Officer Daniels, she said, her voice calm and deliberate. I came in for breakfast as I always do. Mr. Brennan entered the diner visibly agitated. He demanded that I give up my booth for no reason. When I refused, he insulted me, implying that people like me needed to know our place. She paused briefly, meeting Carl's eyes, and when I still refused, he struck me across the face. Daniel swallowed hard and wrote everything down, the sound of his pen scratching across the paper filling the silence. Carl's hands fidgeted on the table. You're twisting it, he muttered, his voice growing thin. You're making me sound like some kind of monster. Malcolm's response was quiet but devastating. You don't have to be made into one, Carl. You already did that yourself. Outside, more sirens wailed. The town's police chief had arrived, and with him came a pair of black SUVs that parked neatly by the curb. The emblem on the side of the vehicles caught the sunlight. Federal Bureau of Investigation. A man in a dark coat stepped out, followed by two agents carrying evidence bags and digital recorders. The sight drew a collective gasp from the crowd that had gathered outside the diner's windows. Reed turned pale. You called them already? Malcolm's voice was calm but implacable. I don't make idle threats. The lead agent, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, entered the diner and nodded toward Malcolm. Agent Price, she said briskly. We got your call. Civil Rights Division dispatched 2 units. We'll take over from here. Carl slumped lower in the booth, his world collapsing around him. He looked toward Reed for help, but Reed was frozen, sweat forming along his hairline. The agents began taking photos, collecting Sarah's video evidence and interviewing witnesses one by one. The whole scene unfolded with professional efficiency, a symphony of order replacing chaos. Evelyn watched silently as the truth built itself piece by piece, her son orchestrating justice without raising his voice. She had always believed that real power wasn't loud. It was calm, deliberate, and rooted in integrity. For years, this town had whispered about equality but rarely practiced it. Now, in this small diner that smelled of coffee and history, the world was being reminded that every person, no matter how ordinary, deserved dignity. When the FBI agents finished their initial work, the lead agent turned to Malcolm. We'll take it from here, Price, but we're also flagging the local PD for federal review. This isn't the first complaint about Officer Reed or his department. Reed's head snapped up. That's ridiculous, he stammered. We run a clean station. Malcolm's expression didn't change. Then you have nothing to worry about, do you? Evelyn finally rose from her seat. Her movement was slow, deliberate, regal in its grace. The diner had returned to silence, the kind that follows a lesson well taught. She turned toward Carl, who could no longer meet her eyes. "I forgive you," she said quietly. The words struck harder than any punishment could. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequence. It only removes hate. You'll have to live with what you've done. And that's the hardest sentence of all. Carl's eyes filled with shame he'd never felt before. The weight of her forgiveness crushed what was left of his pride. As Evelyn stepped toward the door, Malcolm walked beside her, his arm protective yet gentle. "You always forgive too easily," he said softly. She smiled. "It's not about being easy, son. It's about being free." Outside, the air smelled of rain and renewal. People had gathered on the sidewalk, some whispering, others watching in awe. Evelyn looked at them, nodded once, and said, "Sometimes justice doesn't come from anger. Sometimes it just comes from standing up and saying no." Malcolm looked down at her and finally allowed himself a small, genuine smile. "You taught me that," he said. And as mother and son walked down Main Street side by side, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft, cleansing, and full of promise. Inside Harriet's diner, people returned to their meals, but nothing felt quite the same. Respect had been restored, courage had been witnessed, and the town had learned that even the smallest act of cruelty can awaken the largest wave of change. The hidden corruption. The rain that had begun to fall outside Harriet's diner did not stop quickly. It carried on through the rest of that gray afternoon as if the sky itself wanted to wash away the shame that had stained the little town. The streets shimmered under the downpour, and even the old streetlights flickered uncertainly, their glow diffused by the mist. Evelyn and her son Malcolm walked side by side beneath a large black umbrella, their reflections moving together in the puddles that mirrored the world upside down. The air smelled of wet asphalt and new beginnings, yet beneath that freshness was something uneasy, a faint tension that refused to lift. When they reached the small parking lot behind the diner, Malcolm paused beside his government-issued black sedan. He looked at his mother, his eyes softening for a moment before hardening again with purpose. "I want you to go home and rest," he said quietly. "I'll handle everything from here. This isn't over, Mom, not by a long shot." Evelyn smiled faintly, her voice calm but resolute. "It never really is over, son. Justice is never one moment. It's a long walk, but I trust you'll walk it right." She touched his arm gently, that same familiar touch that had steadied him since childhood, and then turned to leave, her steps slow but steady under the rain. Malcolm stood watching her disappear into the distance, his heart heavy with both love and fury. He had seen cruelty before in many forms, in dark alleys, in corporate fraud, and organized crime, but never so plainly, never so brazenly delivered to someone who had done nothing but live with quiet dignity. That kind of injustice gnawed deeper because it was personal, because it wasn't about money or power. It was about disrespect, about the arrogance that came from years of unchallenged privilege. He opened his car door, sat down, and pulled out his tablet. Within minutes, he was connected to the Bureau's central network. His badge number flashed across the screen, followed by a secure login. He began typing notes into a classified case file, Incident at Harriet's Diner Preliminary Findings. He detailed everything: the assault, the witnesses, the potential racial bias, the interference of Officer Reed, and the immediate arrival of the FBI Civil Rights Division. But what bothered him most was not just Carl Brennan's violence, it was the way the police officer had reacted. Reed's familiarity, his reluctance to act, the easy camaraderie with the assailant. Those were signs Malcolm had seen before in places where corruption grew quietly under the surface. And his instincts told him this wasn't an isolated act. It was a symptom of something much larger. That night, while the town settled into uneasy silence, Malcolm sat in his hotel room surrounded by files, witness statements, and his own thoughts. The television played softly in the background, covering the faint sound of the storm still raging outside. He called his colleague, Agent Maria Sanchez, a woman he trusted with his life. "Maria," he said, his voice low, "I need you to pull financial and disciplinary records for Officer Samuel Reed and a civilian named Carl Brennan, both from Crestwood County. Focus on unexplained income, property records, and connections to local businesses or officials. Maria's tone sharpened instantly. You think this goes deeper than the diner incident? I know it does, Malcolm replied. Reed wasn't just protecting a friend. He was protecting something bigger. You could see it in his eyes when the bureau car showed up. He wasn't just afraid of losing his badge. He was afraid of exposure. By morning, Maria had sent over the first wave of data. Malcolm opened the encrypted file as the early sunlight broke through the rain clouds, streaking across the small motel desk. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. Over the last 5 years, Officer Reed had received several anonymous payments through shell companies connected to the county's Public Works Department. Meanwhile, Carl Brennan's name appeared as a subcontractor on multiple inflated invoices. Construction jobs that were billed but never completed. It was a classic small-town graft scheme. City funds funneled through fake projects, kickbacks distributed among friends, and no one the wiser because everyone involved had a reason to stay quiet. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. So that's it, he murmured to himself. They've been stealing from their own people. He thought of his mother sitting quietly in that diner for 30 years, paying for her breakfast with money that probably helped fund these same men's corruption. It made his blood boil, but he reminded himself, control, precision, patience. Those were his weapons now. Later that afternoon, he met with the lead civil rights agent Karen Holt at the local field office. She was a sharp, no-nonsense investigator with 20 years of experience dismantling corrupt systems in places that thought they were untouchable. So what's your plan, Price? She asked, flipping through the files. You want to turn a local assault into a federal corruption case? Malcolm's voice was firm but measured. No. I want to let the assault reveal the corruption. These people think they're above accountability. Carl hitting my mother wasn't just about prejudice. It was about power. He's used to acting without consequence because this entire structure around him enables it. We pull one thread and the whole thing unravels. Karen studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. You're right. But if you're going after the department, you'll need more than bank statements. You'll need witnesses inside. Someone who'll talk. Malcolm's mind immediately went to the younger officer, Daniels. He had seen the hesitation, the conflict in that man's face at the diner. He was not part of the rot, not yet. I think I know someone, Malcolm said. That evening he waited outside the police station as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold. When Officer Daniels exited the building, looking worn and thoughtful, Malcolm stepped forward. Daniels startled slightly, then relaxed when he recognized him. Agent Price, he said cautiously. I figured I'd see you again. Walk with me, Malcolm said simply. They crossed the parking lot slowly, the air filled with the sound of cicadas beginning their nightly chorus. You want to do the right thing, Malcolm began, his tone conversational. I saw it in your eyes yesterday. You knew what was happening wasn't right, but you didn't know how to stop it. Daniels hesitated, his jaw tightening. You don't know this town, he said finally. People like Reed run everything here. If I speak up, I'm done. My career, my family's safety, everything. Malcolm nodded. You're right. I don't know this town the way you do. But I know corruption. And I know that when good men stay quiet, bad ones grow stronger. You think Reed will protect you when this blows up? He'll throw you under the bus without blinking. But if you help us now, you can be part of the reason this town finally changes. The silence between them stretched for a long time. Then Daniels looked down at the ground and whispered, You didn't see the half of it. Reed's not just protecting Brennan. There's money, big money, moving through the sheriff's office. Fake overtime pay, construction contracts, even seized property being resold under fake names. Brennan's brother handles the bank accounts. Reed's in deep. If you go after them, you'll be digging up half the county's leadership. As they talked, the town's mayor passed by outside the diner window, followed by several council members. They had all been summoned to cooperate with the ongoing investigation. Some bowed their heads slightly when they saw Evelyn, as though acknowledging a truth they had long ignored. For years, Crestwood had operated on a quiet hierarchy, those with power and those who endured it. Now that line was blurred, replaced by something humbler, mutual accountability. By late afternoon, the diner was packed again, not with gossipers or curious onlookers, but with neighbors simply wanting to be near one another. The atmosphere was different now, warmer, more honest. People spoke not about money or politics, but about change, about the small ways they could make their community kinder. Evelyn sat listening, her heart swelling with a quiet joy. She thought of her husband long gone and how proud he would have been to see this day. She thought of her son, who had grown into the kind of man who didn't just enforce the law but embodied justice. When the evening light slanted through the windows, painting golden stripes across the room, Malcolm stood up and cleared his throat. "I'd like to say something," he began. The chatter died instantly. "My mother taught me that real strength isn't loud. It doesn't come from fear or anger. It comes from standing firm in truth, even when the world tells you to sit down. What happened here wasn't just a crime, it was a mirror. It showed us who we were, and now it shows us who we can be." There was a pause, then a single clap, then another, until once again the diner filled with applause. Evelyn's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She reached across the table and squeezed her son's hand. "You always had your father's voice," she whispered. That night, as she walked home under a sky bursting with stars, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in years. A sense of peace that went beyond personal vindication. It was the peace of knowing that decency had won, not through rage but through resilience. She paused at the corner where the lamppost flickered softly and looked up at the heavens. The town around her was quiet, but in that silence, she could hear a heartbeat, the slow, steady rhythm of a community learning to live with open eyes and open hearts again. The following days brought more news. Reforms in the police department, transparency laws proposed at the county level, new community boards formed to ensure fairness. People volunteered for civic service, students held discussions about ethics and courage, and Harriet's Diner became a gathering place for conversation instead of complacency. Every so often, someone would glance toward that corner booth and smile as if to say, "That's where it began." Evelyn never claimed ownership of what had happened. She still paid for her breakfast every Tuesday, still tipped Jenny generously, and still stirred her coffee 3 times counterclockwise before sipping. But everyone who saw her knew she carried something rare, the quiet strength that comes from surviving cruelty without letting it define you. And somewhere deep inside, Malcolm knew too. He knew that his mother's defiance had done more to heal a town than all the laws he'd ever enforced, because justice in its truest form wasn't just about punishment, it was about awakening. And Crestwood, for the first time in generations, was awake. The legacy of Evelyn Price years passed, and the memory of that morning in Harriet's Diner became more than just a story. It became a piece of Crestwood's identity, a tale parents whispered to their children about dignity and courage, about how one woman's quiet strength changed everything. The town, once known for its small scandals and big silences, began to thrive in unexpected ways. Streets were cleaner, the community fair board more transparent, and the local police station, once marred by corruption, had become a model of reform across the state. Officer Daniels, now Captain Daniels, carried the lessons of that day like scripture. Under his leadership, every new recruit spent a day at Harriet's Diner, sitting in the same booth where Evelyn Price had once said no to cruelty and yes to her own worth. It was his way of making sure no officer ever forgot that a badge means service, not superiority. Harriet's Diner itself had transformed too. The once modest roadside restaurant now drew visitors from across the county, journalists, school classes, and tourists who came to see the Booth of Courage. Harriet never liked the fame. She would tell people, it wasn't the booth that mattered. It was the woman who sat in it. But she kept the note above it all the same, a little worn now. The ink faded, but the meaning as strong as ever. This seat belongs to those who believe in kindness and courage. And every Tuesday morning, without fail, Evelyn Price sat there wearing her burgundy cardigan, ordering her 2 eggs over easy and black coffee, stirring it counterclockwise 3 times before taking her first sip. Her hair had gone completely silver now, her movements slower, but her presence still commanded the same quiet respect that had once silenced an entire diner. Malcolm, now promoted to assistant director in the bureau, visited as often as his schedule allowed. Each time he walked through the diner door to the familiar chime of the bell, looking like the embodiment of composure, yet softening instantly when he saw his mother. He would remove his jacket, kiss her forehead, and sit across from her with that same mix of pride and humility that had defined their relationship for decades. "You know," he said one morning, "the Bureau's using your story in ethics training now. They call it the Crestwood case. a lesson on justice, integrity, and moral courage. Evelyn chuckled softly, her eyes crinkling. I didn't do it for lessons, baby. I just didn't want to move from my seat. Malcolm smiled, stirring his own coffee. Sometimes that's all it takes. The world changes because one person refuses to move. Outside, the town continued to evolve. The flower shop next to the diner expanded, the college grew, and murals began to appear on walls around Crestwood. Bright, hopeful paintings of hands holding hands, of eyes open wide, of words like unity, truth, grace. Sarah Mitchell, the student whose video had gone viral, graduated with honors in social justice and returned home to start a nonprofit foundation called Project Evelyn, dedicated to supporting elderly citizens and advocating against community neglect. Her first project had been to build a community center for seniors named the Evelyn Price Wellness Hall, where every wall carried stories of resilience and hope. On opening day, Evelyn had been there, cutting the ribbon with trembling but steady hands. The applause had been thunderous, and when she spoke, her voice, though frail with age, still carried that calm authority that demanded to be heard. Don't let the noise of the world make you forget your humanity, she told the crowd. Kindness is not weakness. It's the strongest thing you can be. Harriet had passed away 2 winters earlier, her heart finally giving out one quiet evening after closing up the diner. The town grieved her deeply, and at her memorial, Evelyn stood by the casket, her hand resting on the wood, whispering words no one else could hear. We started something, didn't we, my friend? She said softly. We reminded them what decency looks like. After Harriet's passing, Jenny took over the diner, promising to keep everything just as it had been. She did. Same menu, same red checkered curtains, same corner booth. And every year on the anniversary of the incident, she hosted Evelyn's Day, offering free coffee to anyone who brought a story of a time they had stood up for someone in need. People came from miles away, their voices trembling as they shared tales of defending a stranger, speaking out against cruelty, or choosing honesty when silence would have been easier. The diner had become a beacon, and Evelyn's story the light that kept it shining. As the years rolled forward, Evelyn grew older, but never bitter. Her eyes remained sharp, her mind clear. She read the newspaper each morning and still tutored children in math when their parents couldn't afford extra help. Sometimes she would catch people staring at her in admiration, and she would smile and wave, embarrassed by the attention. I'm not a saint, she would say. I'm just someone who had a bad morning that turned into a good fight. But everyone in Crestwood knew better. To them, she was proof that courage doesn't need a stage or a spotlight. It only needs a heart unwilling to bow. One cold winter evening, as snowflakes drifted lazily down and the diner's windows glowed with warm yellow light, Evelyn sat in her booth for what would unknowingly be her last visit. Jenny brought her usual order, setting the plate gently before her. You know, Jenny said, her voice soft, I think you've taught us all how to live. Evelyn smiled faintly, wrapping her fingers around her coffee cup. Maybe, she said quietly, but I hope I've also taught you how to love. She looked out the window, watching children laugh as they played in the falling snow, and something peaceful settled across her features, a serenity that only comes from a life fully lived. A few days later, she passed away in her sleep, her face calm, her hands folded as though in prayer. The news spread quickly through the town, and for the first time in years, the streets of Crestwood fell completely silent again. Shops closed early, the diner locked its doors, and candles appeared in windows across Main Street. On the day of her memorial, hundreds gathered at the town square. The mayor, the police captain, the students, the construction workers, the same people who had once watched in silence at Harriet's diner, all stood together now, united not by grief, but by gratitude. Malcolm spoke last, his voice steady but thick with emotion. My mother didn't fight with her hands, he said, standing before a portrait of her smiling gently. She fought with her dignity. She showed us that justice isn't loud or vengeful. It's patient, it's firm, and it's human. If you want to honor her, don't wait for the world to give you permission to do what's right. Just do it. When the ceremony ended, the crowd walked together to Harriet's diner, where Jenny had left the corner booth untouched. A single cup of black coffee resting on the table, steam rising into the cold air like a whisper from the past. Above it, she had added one more line to the sign. In loving memory of Evelyn Price, the woman who taught us all to stay seated when it mattered most. The air was heavy with emotion, but it wasn't sadness, it was reverence. Years later, long after Evelyn's passing, Crestwood remained changed. The diner still stood, the murals still shone bright, and children still learned her story in school. Her name had become part of the town's moral fabric, a reminder etched not just on plaques or buildings, but in the hearts of everyone who called that place home. And every time someone spoke up against injustice, offered kindness to a stranger, or chose honesty over convenience, it was said softly, almost like a prayer. That's what Evelyn would have done. Far away, in a quiet office in Washington, Malcolm Price kept a framed photo of his mother on his desk. Every morning, before beginning his work, he would glance at it and whisper, "Still guiding me, Mom." And in that silent exchange between mother and son, between past and future, between loss and legacy, the spirit of Evelyn Price lived on, proof that a single act of courage, born in a small-town diner on an ordinary morning, can echo forever through the world.